Ah, I see you missed your big sister. Just close my eyes? Okay. So this is what
This was never going to be an easy game to review.
When it comes to long-running franchises, it can often be difficult to balance the new fans that a popular new entry may bring, while satisfying what can be considered the classic fanbase who enjoyed the previous games. Whatever grievances one might have with Awakening, its success reinvigorated interest in a series that was, by all accounts, on its last legs, since Awakening was going to be the last entry in the Fire Emblem series if it didn't sell well. And sell well it did. Fire Emblem Awakening became the best-selling title in the series to ever hit the West, completely revitalizing a franchise whose sales were on the declining end for the past few years. Now there's a new card game, a greater presence in the latest Super Smash Bros. Game, an onslaught of new action figures and other merchandise, along with this oddity that's apparently called Shin Megami Tensei Cross Fire Emblem. Or Tokyo Mirage Sessions, same thing. Though Nintendo of America didn't do much in terms of recognizing the series' 25th anniversary last year, in Japan, there was a concert that covered series' favorite tracks, exclusive merchandise, and even replicas of the Falchion made by weapon designer Hato Ken to celebrate the occasion. They even released a book detailing the making of several games in the series, including the most recently released of the bunch, Fire Emblem If, known in North America as Fire Emblem Fates. Just a heads up, we have a lot to get through before we get to the review in proper, starting with the fact that Fire Emblem Fates is not a game. Rather, Fire Emblem Fates is 3 games: Fire Emblem Birthright, Fire Emblem Conquest, and Fire Emblem Revelation. And since they're 3 unique games, we're going to take a look at all 3 of them, along with a separate video discussing a very interesting character called Soleil. Oh my, will we talk about Soleil. But before we get to each individual game, let's take a step back to the past. And by past, I mean Fire Emblem Awakening. Again. See, while Awakening was praised for many things, its story was not among them, especially among fans. Thus, Intelligent Systems set a goal for the next game in the Fire Emblem series: to craft a more complex storyline, eventually 3 interconnected stories in a trio of games that would satisfy both fans old and new. Looking for new ideas to base the story on, one of the producers, Hitoshi Yamagami, recalled an old choice that was made during the series' infancy. In the very first Fire Emblem game, and its 2009 remake, there exists a map, Chapter 16, with 2 villages for Marth to enter, with each village housing a different character, the Paladin Aaron and the hero Samson. Depending on which village you chose, the player would end up with either Aaron or Samson allying with Marth. But there's a catch. The 2 villages are constantly in conflict with one another, so if you choose to visit one village, the other one would close their doors, and Marth could no longer visit them, meaning you had to choose between one of the 2 characters. The choice ultimately didn't affect the overall story, mostly because it was impossible to make said choices matter. The memory limitations that Intelligent Systems had to deal with during the days of the Famicom put any possible plans they had to change the campaign on the shelf, as it just wasn't possible given the technology at the time. I remember how futile it seemed then, and then I said, Maeda-san, wouldn't you want to play a game where you could see what happened if you chose the other side? I want to try this. From there, the team came up with the idea of taking this choice to its logical extreme, by having the player choose between allying with one of 2 different countries, or choosing to side with neither, with each choice affecting the plot in different ways, and exploring the reasons for each side going to war. Now, while those limitations of memory no longer exist, there was one main problem for Intelligent Systems when it came to Fire Emblem Awakening's follow-ups, now 3 new outings. As producer Masahiro Higuchi put it, the task of writing and designing 3 games would be impossible to accomplish in office. Thus, the developer began looking to outsource the script while improving on Awakening's overall design. Quote, "We looked in the game industry, but we couldn't find someone we wanted. So we started to wonder if we could find someone outside the game industry who had done good work writing storylines in other industries, like publishing or movies." Enter Shin Kobayashi, a legendary manga and screenwriter in Japan. Legendary in the most mythical definition possible, since the man wrote a lot of his work under multiple pen names, meaning people grew up reading or watching his work and loving it without ever realizing it was written by him. Fun fact, while Fates is technically his first time working on a video game story, it's not his first time working with video games, having written the manga Fatal Frame Shadow Princess in 2014. Anyway, while busy at the time that Koei Maeda, the director of Fire Emblem Awakening and Fire Emblem Fates, approached him in regards to writing the next Fire Emblem games, Kobayashi was fairly enthusiastic about writing for the series after playing Fire Emblem Awakening, aided by his daughter's comment that,
"The story is kind of cliche, but I think you can make it even better."
Which upon reflection... yeah, Awakening's plot was filled to the brim with cliches, which, while enjoyable in its own right, didn't exactly make for the most epic of fantasy tales, something I say as someone who enjoyed the game thoroughly. Played through it 4 times.
the first draft, which went from a mere 10 pages per path to a massive combined 500 pages, was penned by Kobayashi, who said that, "When I create a story, as I write the details, like the characters' lines, I start to love the characters, and then they take on a life of their own, and the story begins to move on its own. So there was no way I could just write a short plot summary and be done with it." There's some debate as to what happened to this initial draft. According to Shin Kobayashi, various staff members at Intelligent Systems went through it before the final one that appeared in the game. However, the making of Fire Emblem,
which, despite its name, spent most of the book talking about Fire Emblem Awakening and Fire Emblem Fates, while featuring very little of the making of several entries, including BS Fire Emblem Gaiden, and Fire Emblem the Sacred Stones.
seems to contradict this, stating that Intelligent Systems followed Kobayashi's original draft fairly closely, such as "spoilers withheld" and "spoilers withheld," or at least supposedly it does. Without my own copy of the book, it's impossible to verify whether or not this is true. Here's what is known. In addition to penning the original draft, Kobayashi is credited under original story, is said to have created the concept behind the My Castle feature of the game, and the idea of the third path. Naomi Kimura is credited with working on the main scenario for Birthright and Conquest, while the scenario for the third path was scripted by Yukinori Kitajima, who's most well known for Kamiden, and their work on the Senran Kagura series.
Because there apparently wasn't enough fan service in the last entry. Can you tell I'm not a fan of that series?
Okay, to be fair, he also worked in Dual Destinies, but again, it's not entirely clear how much of Revelation's story can be attributed to Kobayashi's initial draft, what Kitajima penned for Revelation, or the involvement of the staff at Intelligent Systems. What is known is that Kitajima and his company Synthes were responsible for writing several of the support conversations for the Birthright and Conquest paths, along with the work of other Intelligent Systems staff members. Believe what you want in regards to the story's writing, because ultimately, what matters is what ended up in the game, not to figure out who to praise or blame, like this is a kindergarten class trying to uncover who brought in or spilled the punch bowl. That said, for whatever praise can be given to Nintendo for advertising Fates in North America, whose initial launch shattered the sales records Awakening's Western debut broke 3 years ago with over 300 copies sold in 3 days, the same cannot be said for them explaining how the different versions of Fate would work. It wasn't until the Nintendo Direct in November that they clarified how the game would be sold in North America. The pricing, the different versions, how they'd be available, etc. In the off chance somebody watching this is still confused about how they work, allow me to explain. In Fire Emblem Fates, all versions of the game share the first 5 chapters, more on those in a moment. Upon reaching Chapter 6, the player must choose between one of 2 choices. Side with the Kingdom of Nor and thus play through Fire Emblem Conquest, or side with the Kingdom of Hoshido and play Fire Emblem Birthright. At least, assuming you're one of the few people to get the special edition, because the standard editions for Fire Emblem Birthright and Conquest don't allow you to freely choose which path you can take, not unless you download the other one via the eShop, which, to Nintendo's credit, can be bought at a discounted price. In addition, there's a third path called Revelation, which cannot be bought on its own and is only available in the special edition or the Nintendo 3DS eShop. Though the image of a Nintendo game spawning multiple versions might conjure images of Fire Emblem turning into Pokemon, a more accurate comparison can be found with The Legend of Zelda Oracle Duality on the Game Boy Color. Interconnected games with a very similar opening, but unique experiences with different weapons, items, and stories that share bonus content between one another upon completion.
Now, because Fire Emblem Fates is 3 separate games, we're going to be taking a look at each one separately, starting with Fire Emblem Fates Birthright. This one is said to be more in line with Awakening than the other 2 routes, so does it succeed where, upon reflection, that game failed? Well, let's find out.
While each of the 3 chapters has their own unique stories to tell, they all share the same opening 5 chapters. Fate stars Corrin, a Norian noble who, after finally proving their battle prowess against their brother Xander, are allowed to lead their fort and partake in a mission for the Norian kingdom, being given a special sword in recognition of their new combat capability. They're sent to scout a fortress along Hoshidan borders before discovering a plot by the Norian king Garon to kill Corrin. This eventually leads to their capture at the hands of a character named Rinka, who hands you over to the leader of Hoshido, Queen Mikoto, who informs you of your Hoshido royal heritage.
What?
Search your feelings. You know it to be true.
And how Corrin was taken away from the True Blood siblings by this not at all evil-looking old man. Yeah, we'll get to Garon in a moment. In the meantime, Queen Mikoto plans to announce the return of her long-lost son before an invisible enemy grabs the sword you were given and kills your mother with it by, magic? Making Corrin transform into a dragon out of pure emotional reaction to this heartless action. This is in spite of Corrin telling Mikoto mere moments ago that he feels nothing for her, but this transformation might have been triggered due to Corrin finally recovering their memories. However, there's no time to reflect on this recent loss, as Corrin is thrust onto a new battlefield, where siblings face off against siblings, brother against brother, and you're forced to choose between 3 paths. Side with your blood-related siblings and walk your birthright path, return to your Norian family in a campaign all about conquest, or choose neither for a certain revelation. There is a 4th option, but...
Which brings me to the main problem with Fates. Namely that, well, this isn't a choice. At least not within the game itself.
While there are story differences between the 2 paths, the reason for choosing between Conquest and Birthright, the 2 main paths, are the differences in terms of structure. Birthright's path falls more in line with Awakening, being more forgiving and allowing the player to grind experience and gold freely.
まず大きく白夜王国については、白夜王国はフリーマップといって経験値や取得するお金であったりとか、そういうところをもらえるポイントみたいなものをマップを用意しておいて、
while Conquest harkens back to the more limited resources of the pre-Awakening era. Thus, the choice is really to pick which game, which overall experience the player would prefer, rather than choosing which side of the war they wish to be on. To compare this to the villages in the first game in Shadow Dragon, choosing which village to visit was a dilemma, since choosing to recruit one of these characters meant deciding between one of them or the other. Deciding between Aaron and Samson was, ultimately, a choice. A choice which, yes, was very simplistic in terms of impact since it didn't affect the story, but it was a choice that the player could make, regardless of their purchasing decision. There are other comparisons that can be made, no doubt, like how Tactics could let us cling together, handle player choice with as many branching paths in one package, but the point is that Fates makes this dilemma meaningless unless you're one of the lucky few to get the special edition. Now, I do happen to have a copy of the special edition, which is a good thing because there's a whole lot more wrong with this option. Namely that this whole moral choice about choosing one family over the other is lessened by the way Fates unsubtly color codes its 2 sides and the events that precede it.
そうですね。今までのファイアーエンブレムであまりなかったその人種をビジュアルで分けるっていう部分っていうのをちょっと今回チャレンジしてみようと思いまして。
Well, that's one way of putting it. Even though previous games have featured several visually distinct races across multiple entries, without their appearance being a physical manifestation of their moral compasses, but I digress. The first thing we see of Norian soil is this barren landscape devoid of any life, full of gnarled trees. The housing looks red and hellish, the soldiers that keep the land clad in black armor, and the actions they partake in being brutal battles, acts of aggression across tranquil borders. Heck, in Conquest, you can add a group of just beautiful trees to your castle, which looks lovely alongside the other plants. In contrast, we have Hoshido, a peaceful, enlightened nation, where the towns are lively and full of caring, welcoming people. Food is as plentiful as the amount of colors seen during a celebratory occasion, with royalty clad in white.
平和を愛する、戦いを望まないような善良な人たちとなっています。彼らが戦争するのは、敵であるアンヤ王国側が侵略をしてきたからで、彼らを侵略に立ち向かう、そして自国の平和を守るっていうのが白夜王国側の行動動機ということになります。
On the subject of finer details, when going through the first 5 chapters shared between the 3 titles, it's hard not to notice the similarities between them and the first 9 chapters that make up Lynch's tale from Reckon no Ken. Both of them star an inexperienced sword wielder who discovers more about their background, which is accompanied by setting up subplots that will be more thoroughly explored in the main plot. In Lynch's tale, it was the Black Fang and the mystery behind the 2 siblings. In Fates, we the escalating conflict between Hoshido and Nor, along with a group of mysterious invisible enemies. From a gameplay perspective, they both serve as a tutorial session, going through the basic mechanics of each title. Permadeath being non-existent, as characters who die during the opening chapters become playable if they're defeated, save for the main character who, if they're defeated, results in a game over. Indeed, these chapters of Fire Emblem Fates serve a similar purpose to Lynch's tale, if Lynch's tale was horribly written. While the description might give the impression that a lot happens in the first few chapters, that's only because of how much is crammed into such a short opening. The game is so eager to get to its drama-devoid dilemma that it forgoes anything more than half-heartedly establishing the scenario and the main players for each path, preferring to recycle elements from Awakening with diminishing returns. Opening with a premonition that plays out in a later chapter with a minor variation, the discovery of the player character by a kind-hearted individual after waking up from an unconscious slumber, the prevalence of amnesia in the player character's arc, and the death of a family member brought about by their efforts to protect someone close to them. The similarity between the first 5 chapters of Fates and the first 9 chapters of Awakening is uncanny. There's also one big difference between Fates and Rekken no Ken in terms of focus. Namely, you weren't Lyn in Fire Emblem. For the 4th time in the series, the game features a player avatar, though this time, they're the main character of the game. While an interesting decision, the increasingly self-insert, borderline fanfics throughout the series is turning towards, i.e. turn into a dragon, marry whoever you want, well, so long as you're straight, we'll get to that, and deciding who you want to side with is becoming a bit too intrusive on the overall plot. One of the things about Rekken no Ken that worked so well was the way it used its player avatar as a means of reinforcing one simple fact. You are not these characters, and this is not your story. You're tagging along for their adventure, but that doesn't mean you don't have an important role. Yours is perhaps the most important of all. Commanding everyone on the battlefield and ensuring the best possible strategy is carried out, choosing who is best to fight alongside who to talk to, and where they're needed. There is a surprisingly clever, almost meta nature to its implementation, in that this tactician shares the same role as the player, guiding their favorite character across the grid in turn-based tactical delight. Most importantly, it was completely non-intrusive, to the point where the game could remove all mention of this character without losing any details for the other characters or their story. In Awakening, Robin served a similar role as the tactician to Rekken no Ken, albeit not as wholly effective due to an increasingly important role in Chrome's story, to the point where the game's ending was left up to their discretion. Thus, we come full circle with Fire Emblem Fates, where the game literally revolves around you. Your decision affects the entire plot. It affects who wins the war, it affects which major characters will die, everything bends towards the whims of Corrin and, by extension, the player. No other factors like the amount of troops, where these battles take place, the other commanders in charge of this international war that the writer could have considered. The plot ignores any of these to predetermine the victor based solely on which side you choose to ally yourself with, which does an overall disservice to the stories that accompany this decision. When playing through the 2 main paths, one can't help but feel that Corrin is perhaps a bit too intrusive on the plot, the events that take place across Birthright and Conquest, in contrast to the role they play. This isn't to say that Corrin is a terrible character, although they are a fairly unremarkable one, aside from their poor memory. This is without getting into how Lyn's tale was also much lengthier and did a much better job of teaching the player how the mechanics work. Admittedly, the mechanics underlying that game were much simpler in comparison to Fates, which is why the shorter length is baffling, because the 2 hours at most time it takes to reach the decision isn't exactly enough time to introduce and tutorialize the unique aspects attributable to Fate's mechanics, nor is it enough time to be properly introduced to the core relationships of Corrin's Nohrian family. These relationships are supposed to hold great meaning for the character and the player they represent, but the game doesn't get the player invested enough to make them feel like they are this character in this role within this world at this moment, given how little time is spent with them, to the point where it barely qualifies as an introduction. The earlier events play out in such a way that it makes it at best difficult to side with Corrin's Nohrian siblings, failing to justify an in-game reason to give the conquest path to try based on what we do know of these characters and their relationships to one another. There are minor traits that can be picked up on, given repeated playthroughs such as Ryoma's rational thinking, or Camilla's interest in her brother. However, characterization is incredibly light on both sides during these opening chapters. Likewise, familial bonds are only mentioned in passing to establish they exist, rather than to make these relationships meaningful to the characters which share them. They're never made important until the game reminds you at the very moment you're required to make a decision between bond or blood. By then, the sentiment rings hollow. Thus, it's left to the preceding events and the personal beliefs of familial bond and blood of the player in order to make the decision.
Well, that's not entirely true. See, there is one person who is given heavy characterization in the opening chapters. A delightful, well-rounded fellow by one King Garon.
How best to describe King Garon? Imagine your favorite Saturday morning cartoon villain, minus any quality that made them likable, and replaced with pure sadism. King Garon is a caricature of a Fire Emblem villain, a being whose motivation is domination and power for the sake of domination and power, almost taking a perverse pleasure in seeing his opponents submit to his will and his subordinates obey without question. But that's just the tip of this ill-rounded individual. In addition to kidnapping Corrin as an infant right after killing his true father, Garon is responsible for mind-wiping any knowledge of this event occurring or any other memories of your Hoshido upbringing, goes out of his way to murder anyone who might pose the slightest possible threat to the throne, if not threatening his very children with the punishment of death for failing a mission, locked you up in a fortress with little contact with your Norian siblings for most of your life, presumably so you never learn about your heritage, or posed a threat by discovering how to tap into your draconian form, and made multiple attempts to kill you, mere hours before the very battle, where you must make a choice between this family or your blood-related siblings. What possible reason could there be for choosing the side of this sadistic monster masquerading as a man?
Well,
You need to hear his side. The man who has tried to kill you on 3 separate occasions, once with Hans, twice with the sword which, by the way, he gave to you. That man has to explain his reasoning for trying to kill you. You know, there are characters in the series who can be a little naive. There are characters who believe in the best of humanity, who try to resolve conflicts diplomatically before brandishing a blade. And yet none of them were this stupid to... You know what? I don't care. Proceed.
You poor thing. Orphaned at such a tender young age.
You killed his father! You vacuous piece of human garbage! This character is the main reason why Birthright is getting a gander at before Conquest. Garon is such a horrible human being, yet not horrible enough to elevate him in such a way like how Kefka became the endearingly chaotic highlight of Final Fantasy VI. The only quality Garon exhibits from that throne is beard-strokingly evil. This is the person that the game would have both the player and Corrin call father and return home to. A man who would likely consider your actions with the Hoshidans an act of insubordination, regardless of whether or not Corrin was set up by him. Garon is a terribly written, one-note villain who just hits it as hard as possible. And that note is...
Oh, and spoilers, if you do decide to side with Nor, yeah, he tries to kill you. Right when you come back, which is only stopped by your siblings' multiple pleas before he sends you off on a mission, all by yourself, to suffer miserably and die. Are you starting to see why I think this character is just a wee bit one note? But we'll talk more about this delightful character when we get to Fire Emblem Fates Conquest.
Side note, when your game is acknowledging that your villain's mere expression of joy is marinated malice, perhaps it's best not to give their position any form of validity. Now, to be frank, no one should go into Fates expecting to have both sides treated fairly. The whole right or wrong, paragon or renegade, two-sided approach to morality in video games is based on an overly simplistic view of human values that is rarely ever explored beyond a simplistic black or white scenario. But that's kind of the problem. Despite the treatment that Hoshido receives from its warmongering neighbor Venetian, Fire Emblem Fates treats siding with Nor like it's an equally valid option in this moment, framing it as sticking with a family you were raised with, when said family has you isolated from them for most of your life and only decides to let you play a larger role in their royal affairs because Garon's desire to conquer a kingdom who show no signs of hostility finds you to be a potentially useful pawn in his complicated game of chess. Not that the rest of the Norian scum ever incentivizes an alliance with them based on their unlikable legion of characters. Yeah, the decision is incredibly one-sided and in favor of Hoshido, but to return to the village's comparison once more, while the decision wasn't some complicated morality play, both choices were presented as equally valid, even if the after effect wasn't as extensive as the one in Fates. The attempt at making a more complex story with greater nuance and ambiguity as to what's truly right or wrong, full of difficult choices to make, is admirable at the very least. It's one of the few things to like about Radiant Dawn, at least on paper, with different factions fighting against or with one another for various political reasons. But, like Radiant Dawn, the execution to this intriguing concept is just terrible. This is not going to be the last time the story is compared to Radiant Dawn, rest assured.
Bear in mind that these are just the issues with the first 5 chapters that these 3 games share. After choosing the logical decision of siding with Hoshido, and thus beginning the Birthright path, well, it gets better. Not fantastic, but it is an improvement.
What?
Birthright finds Corrin siding with the family they were born into, rather than the one that raised them, defending their new homeland of Hoshido, while their brothers Ryoma and Takumi disappear. This leaves Korin fighting on two different fronts, fending off the invading North forces, while finding out about what happened to their True Blood brothers behind the Allied lines. As far as Fire Emblem plots are concerned, it's pretty standard fare, albeit there are a few gripes to be had. For one, the intrigue raised by your missing siblings goes for the most simplistic possible answer for each while resolving them all too quickly, which contributes to how rushed the earlier chapters feel in comparison to the later ones. While Birthright's story benefits from sharing the spotlight with more characters, even if it does provide more for the Hoshido family than minor characters, said characters eventually begin espousing more exposition than dialogue that furthers the development outside of support conversations. That said, the support conversations they share are superb, bringing yet another colorful group of characters to life. One of the more disappointing aspects is that, with one exceptional exception, the many bosses you face will only yield new information or flesh out the main character, if that. One of the small touches from the pre-Shadow Dragon era of Fire Emblem was that, whenever the bosses would battle one of several characters, the two would engage in a unique conversation before combat. Sure, not every boss had an elaborate yarn attached to them, but it helped flesh out those chosen characters and humanize the villains, made them seem more like people within the world than just a generic baddie to be beaten, an obstacle to be overcome. While there are some of these conversations in Birthright, the vast majority of them go to Korin with repetitive results. Korin is sad that they have to fight, while the boss says the same thing they did during the opening chapter. It's not like there was no opportunity for more of these to happen. In Birthright, one of the first characters to join you is a cavalier named Silas, a soldier who defects from Nor to fulfill a promise he made to the main character. Yet not a single line is shared between him and any of the bosses. It would have been a lot more interesting for him to have to deal with those he once called allies and possibly friends claim he's a turncoat. Or heck, have the siblings on both sides come into conversational conflict and show off their differing personalities. Takumi giving Liu an attitude about their spineless treachery, the two older protective sisters facing off against one another over who had better protect their dear brother, define them more by their character than their archetype.
Don't forget.
In Chapter 15, you come across a village of Wolfskin, basically werewolves that can control the transformation via stones. Long story short, you end up fighting them because magic. One would think that, by facing out the chiefs of this village against a Kitsune, the other notable animal transforming unit, or Korin's dragon form, that this conflict might give a little information about the mysterious Kitsune or dragons, perhaps different ideologies of their kin, like one might see with the different races in Fire Emblem Path of Radiance? Nope. It's missed opportunities like these that make the world all the more black and white in terms of who's truly right or wrong, based on the actions characters partaken during this war. Speaking of characters, there's one which, without wishing to spoil, makes a thoroughly boneheaded decision, which is borderline blood pack levels of contrived, constructed drama. There's quite a few too many of these melodramatic moments, most of which are unsurprising, and leaves an unpleasant aftertaste every time the game gluttonously guzzles down on one of them. Even though there are some legitimately great twists and turns, most of their impact stems from one's familiarity with the series archetypes in relation to how well the game subverts them. The story is also far more tell than show in this presentation. Whereas previous games would have utilized the gameplay to convey a given scene, be it to show a character's strength or the futility of a battle, Birthright relies on its written dialogue and the occasional hand-drawn sequence than the character's physical actions to further the story, let alone the gameplay, post the Chapter 6 split. This wouldn't have been as bad had the game's writing had any interest in crafting a compelling tale about these two nations, but its ambition only finds success in a scarce moment or so, the story falling apart near the closing chapters, where it drags its feet towards the inevitable conclusion, along with slinging some contrived and predictable quote-unquote dramatic moments in that time frame, while leaving a load of unanswered questions come the end game. Presumably they'll be answered during the revelation path, but, and this is putting aside the fact that having to play through an entire game just to gain resolution for the feelings of another game, within the story of Birthright, it's incredibly disappointing for many of them to not be addressed. It would be an exaggeration to call the story bad. It's too dull to be given that label. Rather, it's thoroughly disappointing in an inoffensive manner. Had it not been for some charming support conversations, the writing would have been waiting on the weaker side of the series pool. Thankfully, the gameplay more than makes up for the story's shortcomings.